interviews called Devil's Advocate. Well, here is the Devil's Advocate himself. We invite Karan Thapar to the dais. His interlocutor is Shankar Aiyar, and we call him to the stage to be seated as well. And as you saw earlier, they have made their own seating arrangements. In his latest book, Devil's Advocate, Karan dives deep into his life to come up with fascinating stories of warm and lasting friendships, of incidents that leave a deep impression, such as Sanjay Gandhi's flying maneuvers, Amitabh Bachchan losing his cool during a post-interview lunch, or when Kapil Dev cried like a baby. Shankar Aiyar is a former Foreign Service officer, an outstanding and outspoken politician who now has the additional reputation of being one of India's leading columnists. He is often seen on television, and so far he has published 8 books, including the Pakistan Papers. So let's hear the two discuss Devil's Advocate with the irreverence and humor associated with both of them. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have with me Karan Thapar playing the opposite role to the one he normally does. I'm going to do the Karan Thapar trick, and he's going to suffer, as I so often have, on his screen. As the theme of this session of the Khushwant Singh Literary Fest is Stree Shakti, or women's empowerment, I'm going to take Karan through his book through the eyes of several prominent women who figure in the book. The men will play a cameo role from time to time, but otherwise we're going to concentrate particularly on the women. And I'll unlock the treasure trove straight away by saying that the women whose interaction with Karan will be discussed during the course of the morning include, most important of all, his close friend Benazir Bhutto, followed by Jayalalitha, with Maggie Thatcher and Jaya Bachchan thrown in. And then we'll take up Aung San Suu Kyi, and finally just touch upon Indira Gandhi, because there's not very much about her in the book. So to begin with, let's start with Benazir Bhutto. Karan's friendship with Benazir began at the Cambridge Union. It so happened that he was vice president of the Union when Benazir first came to the Cambridge Union from Oxford, and then in the Lent term of 1977, that is the middle term of the 3-term academic year, which is called Lent in Cambridge and is known as Hilary at Oxford. They both happened to be president of their respective unions at exactly the same time. And it was a Lent that was extremely tumultuous, both in Pakistan and in India. Benazir's father had just thrown away an election by rigging it, and that took him straight to the gallows. Indira Gandhi had called off the emergency and found both the cow and the calf losing. So it was a tumultuous time. And in that period, at the Cambridge Union, and I'll throw in the Oxford Union for a bit, because while it's a certainly inferior place, it's not all that inferior. The premise just proved that it is the union, that it is the inferior university, because he went to it. The unions delight in having subjects that bring a smile to your face even before the debate starts. Thus, in my time, which was a good 15, 16 years before Karan's time, I remember a debate which went, in the opinion of this House, Christopher Columbus went too far. But in his time, he has several amusing little subjects to suggest. One was that this House prefers Marx and Spencer to Spencer and Marx. The next, which I absolutely love, is a drink before and a cigarette after are the three best things in life. Then he has the comical subject, politics is an honorable profession. And he got Jeremy Thorpe to participate in it. And immediately after he participated, he was hauled up for both homosexuality as well as murder. But the one that Benazir, and he tried to take on Benazir, and Benazir gave him a fitting answer, was on the subject at the Cambridge Union, when he was vice president, this House would have sex before marriage. Now over to you, Karan, to tell us the story of you and Benazir in the context of sex before marriage.
Mani, it was, as you said, probably the Michaelmas term of 1976 when I was vice president, and she was, I think, the treasurer, which is what they called the vice president at Oxford, the treasurer of the Oxford Union. And she'd come to propose the motion, this House would have sex before marriage. And she was wearing, if I recall correctly, a green chiffon Mukesh sari with those lovely silver dots on it. And in those days, Pakistani women had no great compunction about wearing saris. They wore them fairly frequently. Benazir's mother was frequently seen in a sari. And Benazir was proposing this motion, this House would have sex before marriage. I was sitting to the right of the President, and the President has a little bell which is called the dingle-dangle, because it dingle-dangles from his chair. But it is only for the President, and it is for him to press when he wants to bring the House to order, particularly when it's become unruly. It is not for the Vice President to reach out, grab, and press. But irresistible as it was, when Benazir began her speech, I said to myself, this would be a gorgeous moment to interrupt her. So I leant over, grabbed the President's dingle-dangle, if you know what I mean, and pressed it. And there was a hush in the House, and Benazir turned and looked at me, and I said, Madam, I see you're proposing the motion, you would have sex before marriage. Would you care to practice what you preach? And there was a huge applause from the audience, and I felt extremely thrilled with myself, and I sat down, and she waited cleverly for the applause to die down, and then she swiveled around, whipped off her glasses, wrinkled her nose, and said, certainly, but not with you.
Give us a few more of those stories. You had presented her when you were called to the Oxford Union, where she was president of the Union, and said, the book I'm giving you could well be your biography. It's called All the President's Men. And what was her answer?
God, you got me there.
She said, if the rest of your speech is as bad as your start, perhaps I should ask you to stop and sit down.
But the person who was even better than me was someone else who was also speaking at that particular debate, and I think it was, I describe him in the book as an unnamed Australian gentleman, and half apologize and half take delight in the fact that I can't remember his name. Since then, I've researched it and discovered it wasn't, believe it or not, it was Malcolm Turnbull, who went on to become Prime Minister of Australia. Malcolm Turnbull had returned to the Oxford Union as a former student of Oxford to participate in this particular debate. And Oxford Union and Cambridge Union presidential debates, which is when the presidents of the two unions retire, are usually fun occasions. And the whole evening is devoted to either making good-natured fun of the retiring president or extravagantly praising him or her, which is another form of sarcasm rather than meant intentionally. And he looked at her and said, Madam, I am so moved by you, I'm going to burst into song. And he burst into, Don't Cry for Me, Islamabad. Right? And it was particularly poignant because it was roughly 7 to 8 weeks before her father actually fell from power. And the protests that then catapulted it to riots, which then led to a slow and steady declaration of martial law, was beginning. So it was a particularly poignant moment for her.
No, you missed your punchline.
The audience need me, but then Mani and I won't be able to see each other. It will be extremely difficult because you'll be like...
All right, I think before we miss the point, after Mr. Turnbull had said what he did and sung what he did, Benazir interrupted him as President of the Union and said, every queen is entitled to a court jester, but if you're looking for a job, I suggest you try the goon show instead. I already have enough fools around me. Then they became really very close friends, and as a sign of friendship, Benazir gave him a 45 RPM record, and one of the two songs was, You're More Than a Number in My Little Red Book. And as she presented it to him, she said, do you remember?
She did indeed. She said, I bet you're going to go and tell everyone about this, and when you do, I'll know you're nothing better than a wretched Indian.
All the time, this India-Pakistan theme is a subtext to almost every conversation that Benazir has with him, whether as undergraduates at Oxbridge or even subsequently when she becomes Prime Minister twice over and then is killed on her third attempt to become Prime Minister. He says of Benazir that again and again she told him that the strident persona she assumed in 1988-89, I personally was also involved at that time with Rajiv Gandhi and his interaction with her. I think the strident persona was more 1989-90 than 1988-89. But she told him that she felt that strident persona was a mistake. And she told me what Karan says, she said to everybody, at least in private conversation, that what she'd done in Kashmir, sparking the riots which began in 1990 and continue till today, owing to incompetent handling of the situation in Kashmir, was a mistake on her part. She shouldn't have provoked that. But, says Karan, from 2001 onwards, as the beginning of this century, and she opted for soft borders, free trade between the two parts of Kashmir, bizarrely a joint parliament for Kashmir, and on her part pledged that she would clamp down on private militias, shut terrorist camps, extradite Dawood Ibrahim, and give India access to, I don't know what she meant by that, but give India access to the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. And then says Karan, and that's the point I want him to elaborate on, he says that this was more or less the line that Musharraf took, which led to Musharraf's 4-point formula on resolving the Kashmir issue. So would you like to just expand on that a little further?
The Benazir that first attracted attention in India as Prime Minister was the lady who was heard saying on television, "Gali gali mein bacha kehta hai, azadi, azadi, azadi." And she said it in a particularly shrill, hectoring, unpleasant sounding tone. And it went down very badly with people in India. And I remember on one of her visits to this country, and we were sitting and chatting at the coffee shop of the Taj Mahal Hotel, Mansingh Road, and someone came up and said, "Miss Bhutto, you don't know me, but can I say something?" And she said, "Yes, of course." And she was a bit startled that someone had completely come out of the blue. And this person brought up the Azadi, 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 Azadi slogan. He said, "Is that really you? Is that really what you mean? Because you sound so different when we see you on television, but this was so unlike that image that we have." And I think it shook her, because by the time she became Prime Minister the second time round, she was determined to try and do what she could to sort out the problem. She'd begun to see terrorism for what it was. She'd begun to see through the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed. Well, the Jaish-e-Mohammed hadn't even come into being. It had only just come into being. And, forgive me, it hadn't come into being. And she was particularly concerned about Hafiz Saeed and Dawood Ibrahim, who she felt were people that were deliberately provocative of India, determined to try and spoil whatever relationships civilian politicians on either side tried to set up. And had she lived, I think the Benazir would have formed a government the third time round, and she looked as if she was going to win that election in 2007, 2008 when she got assassinated, would have been a very different Prime Minister. People say much the same of Rajiv, that if he'd lived, he would have been a very different Prime Minister as well. And these are obviously the great ifs, the great imponderables of history that we'll never know the answer to. What you're left with is tantalizing impressions, probably presented as conclusions, sometimes perhaps a little hastily, like people like me. But that is the closest we'd have to trying to work out what she would have been like had she lived, or what Rajiv would have been like had he lived. But I do believe that by 97, 98, Benazir was changing, and certainly the Benazir that returned from Dubai and exile was very different to the Benazir that had been in power a decade earlier.
Much as I hate to get away from the subject of Pakistan, before I do, I want to ask you one more question. The one substantive political contribution you have made to India, apart from bullying various politicians, has been the role that you played in bringing L.K. Advani, who is truly a hawk, in touch with Ashraf Jahangir Qazi, who was the High Commissioner of Pakistan in India, and through them and their contacts, respectively with Musharraf, setting up the Agra summit. My question is that while Advani may have been really in many ways the key reason why the Agra summit was set up, is it not true that Advani, as widely believed in both countries, was the person responsible for torpedoing the Agra summit after Musharraf's press conference?
Certainly that is an impression that General Musharraf very clearly and explicitly conveyed in almost so many words, that Advani was the hidden hand, I think as Musharraf referred to him, that was responsible for the collapse of that summit. Ashraf Qazi was not ever so unequivocal and clear about it. He believed that Advani had perhaps had a somewhat deceptive change of heart, but he didn't think Advani actually blocked the summit succeeding. He just thought that Advani had turned lukewarm. And the first sign that Advani was turning lukewarm was when he met Musharraf in Delhi at Rashtrapati Bhavan, where he called on him the day before they went to Agra and actually brought up Dawood Ibrahim. And Ashraf felt that was the wrong thing to do at that early stage. Dawood and other subjects like that should have been brought up in Agra, not brought up at a courtesy call that you're paying when pleasantries are basically what you discuss rather than substantive issues. But that may be, with hindsight, the beginning of Advani becoming lukewarm and becoming a little shaky. But there's a difference between becoming lukewarm and shaky and becoming the actual block, the obstacle on which Agra stumbled. And Ashraf, I don't think ever believed that Advani was the stumbling block, but he did believe that Advani had become lukewarm, and the enthusiasm with which Advani had pursued matters till the convening of the summit had disappeared.
Well, we have to get back to the ladies. We've had too many minutes with Advani and Ashraf. I want to talk to you about the relationship, which is the key theme in your book, between journalists and politicians through the perspective of your interaction with three different women. One, Jayalalitha, who was very angry with you, didn't walk off your stage, but asked to have the interview re-recorded, and you adamantly refused to do so. But when you met her again several years later, she smiled at you, and you thought she must be smiling at someone else, but it turned out that she was smiling at you. And then she said to you, after you described what you had attempted to do, she said, "So, an interview is a game, even an act. I suppose journalists and politicians are like cops and robbers, but in this case, who's the cop and who's the robber?" And you don't tell me in the book, you don't tell your readers in the book, your answer to the question. So I'm asking you now, on behalf of Jayalalitha, even though that will make her turn in her grave, who's the cop and who's the robber in the journalist-politician relationship?
I'll happily answer that question, but a small little correction. It wasn't Jaya Lalita who made that comment to me. It was a lady at a cocktail party commenting on the way I do interviews and how people usually walk out and get upset, that brought her long conversation where she was berating me to an end with this comment.
Well, so long as it's a lady, it's all right. You can answer the question.
Who is the cop and who is the robber? Actually, it's an interchangeable role. There are several occasions where the journalist is perhaps the robber because he is, or she is, because journalists are often, and some of the best journalists are often ladies, stealing something from the politician that the politician is not necessarily willing or wanting to hand over. That's when you're trying to expose, you're trying to work your way under the skin of the interviewee, you're trying to bring to the surface an issue that the interviewee is unkeen to discuss and particularly defensive about. It's a bit like stealing from him an opinion or an answer or a conclusion that he is reluctant to give. In that instance, the metaphor would probably suggest that the journalist is the robber, the politician is the cop. But quite often, journalists don't succeed in actually getting brilliant answers out of politicians. Politicians are extremely canny people, as Mani is well aware, and can hold their own extremely well also. But what journalists do in those circumstances is to hold forth a series of probing questions that themselves reveal to the audience the nature of the dubious position in which the politician is. The politician's answers may not, forgive the word, incriminate him or her, but the questions suggest that he or she is in an incriminating situation, and the questions reveal that even if he's not or she's not answering, there are a whole lot of questions that they do need to answer, that they're in a dubious position, and in that instance, the journalist is perhaps being the cop, and I'm not sure whether the converse applies, that the politician is being the robber. But my point is that depending upon the nature of the interview, depending upon the person you're interviewing, this description could be interchangeable.
But I think you're putting a gloss on it. So much so that perhaps you should be a politician rather than a journalist. Because it seems to me that you've given your story away at page 8, where you describe how you felt when you became house captain at Jaipur House Doon School. I quote Karan Thapar, page 8. After 4 years of being treated as a wimp, and this is because he, like me, was terrible at sports, and the Doon School is all about brawn and very little about brain, and somehow we both survived that early bad education. But what you say is, after 4 years of being treated as a wimp, it was exciting to be in a position to exercise power. Was that the birth of Karan Thapar as the devil's advocate? Are you just a school bully?
Yes, I suspect that's absolutely true. And I have to tell you a little story here, because this bullying nature is obviously innate in me. It's almost intrinsic to me, because frequently when my mother was the person I was talking to, she'd look at me and say, "Stop it now, stop it, you're not interviewing me." And I said, "But what have I done?" She says, "You keep repeating yourself. I have a right not to answer questions. And don't you understand that if I've chosen to ignore your question, it means I don't want to answer it. Stop repeating it." And this habit of repeating myself with determination and insistence, sometimes even with aggression or at least with assertiveness, is, I suppose, a reflection of a school bully, but it is also, I suppose, inside me. It's intrinsic to my character. It's inseparable from the rest of me.
So apart from being a bully, you're also glib about subjects you know nothing about. And this was discovered.
And all journalists.
And
art politicians as well.
And this was discovered, yeah. But I didn't discover it. According to you, it was your senior tutor at Pembroke College, Cambridge, Michael Posner, who discovered the fraud in you. Because while he was getting ready, you picked up a book on Indian economics that he or somebody else had written. And so when he strode in and found that you were pretending to understand Indian economics, he put you a question, and you happily answered that question. And he said, what has now become the first principle on which I see you grilling TV guests on your programs, he said, "You're being very glib, aren't you?" And you perceptively remarked that speaking glibly has stood me in good stead since. So on the one hand, your job is to rob honest politicians of their honor, and on the other, to do so by speaking glibly about subjects you know nothing about.
Let me tell the audience that story, because it's actually quite a lovely one. I think at the time 18, I was still at Stowe finishing my A-levels. I'd done a pre-A-level entrance examination to Cambridge, and I'd been summoned by Pembroke for an interview. And I arrived full of enthusiasm and excitement, but utterly unprepared for what was going to happen. And so when the porter said to me, Michael Posner is expecting you, his rooms are straight down, and on the left-hand side, staircase N and up on the first floor. I arrived and the door was open, and I found that a bit disconcerting, an open door, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. So I knocked on the open door, and there's nothing more nervous than an 18-year-old who's determined to make a good impression, finds the door open and doesn't know what to do. Do you walk into a room where the door's open? Do you wait outside and wait to be invited in? Anyway, I knocked on the door, and a voice said from deep inside the room, "Come in!" So I walked in, and the room was empty. And then there was the voice again. It said, "I'm in the loo! Make yourself at home, find something to read, I'll be out in a minute." So I walked into the study, which was a wood-lined room, bookshelves all the way from the floor to the ceiling, and there were two comfortable old armchairs. And I wasn't again sure what to do. Do I read a book? Do I sit down? Do I make myself at home? I mean, 18-year-olds could be paralyzed with nervousness, and I was extremely nervous because I knew that first impressions matter. So I stood by an upright lamp, grabbed a book from one of the shelves, and I was thumbing through it when this beast, this bear-like man, he was an elephant, walked in, and with one hand pushed me into a chair and sat down in another opposite me and said to me, "Now, what are you reading, young man?" So I handed him the book. "Ah," he says, "the Indian economy." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, what can you tell me about the present state of the Indian economy?" I said, "Christ, I've fallen into the worst possible trap, and I've done it. I wish I'd picked up a newspaper or a comic instead." Anyway, I started to gabble, and I spoke non-stop for about 3 minutes. But when I suddenly discovered that he was utterly distracted, he was thumbing through the papers in his hands, and I presumed this was my application form. And as he began thumbing through this, I shut up because clearly I'd lost his attention. And he looks up and he says, he says, "I see not knowing the subject is not a handicap for you. You can carry on talking."
And that is the beginning of Karan Thapar of television. He also tells us the principles on which he runs his programs, which apparently he learned under Charlie Douglas Hume, the brother of Alec Douglas Hume, who was a temporary transient PM. Nephew, I see, all right. At the London Times, and then under John Burt at the London Weekend Television, and returned to India after several years in the United Kingdom, working professionally apart from studying, and then has the gall to inform us of what is the basis, what are the principles, as he calls them, of how he runs his television programs. His first great principle is placing the interviewee on the horns of a dilemma so that they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. This is the morality that informs him. He also tells us that Charlie Douglas Hume taught him that you should perhaps just keep quiet because silence is a great strength. Why? Because it often encourages guests to carry on talking till they end up saying things they never intended to. So his whole purpose is that since there are only 4 possible answers to any question, either yes or no, or don't know, or won't tell, the instruction is you force the interviewee to convert don't know or won't tell into either yes or no. And then there's a curious thing. He is absolutely obsessed, Karan is, not with the mark he is making on the audience, but with whether his story will make it to the front page of next day's newspapers. At page 46, he says, providing headline-making news for next morning's paper. At page 106, he says, that's what he did in the Vajpayee interview, made the headlines next day. And then the Obama interview, page 161, make for front page headlines. 2 questions. 1, You are part of the media. Why do you want to find recognition in some other part of the media? Why are you obsessed with next day's newspaper?
Can I answer that quickly?
And secondly, does this not amount to chasing sensation rather than balance or the truth? You are grabbing tomorrow's headlines by tripping up somebody who has lots of important, interesting things to say, but which your audience will find boring because you're not bullying the interviewer. So you haven't changed since you were a 15-year-old boy.
Since I was house captain of Jaipur House. Your first question, one of the reasons why television journalists particularly look for newspaper headlines or newspaper accounts of the interviews that they've done is because, and this is the truth, although few television journalists would admit it, I think a lot of television people have a slight complex about print. There's something very substantial about print. It's in your hands, it's there in black and white, you can turn the pages, you can archive it, you can find it in any moment in time, and once it's in print, it's undeniable. Television, on the other hand, feels ephemeral, it feels of the moment, it feels as if something that's been said and then it disappears into the ether and it's gone forever. And television journalists the world over, this is not just an Indian phenomenon, this is certainly not just true of Karan Thapar alone, but the world over, television journalists make deliberate, sometimes sensational, but often designed to be attractive, press releases of things that they've done, of interviews that they've done, hand them to the agencies and hand them to the newspapers and look anxiously the next morning to see if those press releases have been picked up and have made stories. And it's a reflection of the fact that at the end of the day, although television has a far bigger reach, and although television often makes a bigger impact, but nonetheless there's something about cold news print that television has some slight lingering complex about.
Marvelous. But then tell us,
the second half of your question.
Why you put this Me Too question to Amitabh Bachchan.
I'll come to that in a moment's time.
But let me finish.
You don't want to answer
because
you don't want to answer your second question?
We are talking about ladies and how their empowerment is being restricted by people like you. Now, I'm not saying that you are like MJ Akbar. What I'm saying is that on television, with the cameras running, taking advantage of a remark that Amitabh Bachchan had made during the break when the cameras were not running, Karan seizes his moment.
Let me tell them that story.
And says with Jaya Bachchan present, if not on camera, in the room, he says to Amitabh Bachchan, after your marriage, have you had an affair with any other woman? Now, I'm going to leave the rest of the story to him.
This was an interview that was done for a video magazine. In those days, there were no television programs on Indian television that were independent and therefore neutral or owned by private channels. Private channels themselves didn't exist. So Eyewitness and Newstrack were the two video magazines that attempted to make television for people and be circulated through video libraries or through subscription. And we decided at Eyewitness that we would do a lengthy 50-minute interview with Amitabh Bachchan to mark his 50th birthday. So that would tell you that this story is 26 years old. And the idea was to show that interview in two 25-minute parts, part one in 1 month, part two in the subsequent month. And during the recording of the interview, as the tapes were being changed, Amitabh said to me that he had seen an interview with the American actor Warren Beatty, where the interviewer had asked Warren Beatty about all the women in his life. And Amitabh said that I found this fascinating. We've all heard about Warren Beatty's girlfriends and the women he's allegedly had affairs with, but I've never seen Beatty being questioned about them, and it was absolutely fascinating to see him being questioned. So I said to myself, this is a bizarre thing to say to someone who's in the process of interviewing you. Am I being given a hint? I mean, one doesn't say this sort of thing unless you're actually inviting something similar to happen to yourself. And I found the thought irresistible. And so when the tape change finished, and tape changes take about 3-4 minutes or 5 minutes in those days, I said to myself, well, right, this is precisely what I'm going to do. But my problem was, I wasn't researched for this subject, and I'm not someone who's au fait with Bollywood, gupshup and gossip. So I was at a bit of a loss about the women allegedly in Amitabh's lives. I only could think of two, Praveen Babi and Rekha. So when the tape change was finished and we began the interview, I briefly repeated what Amitabh had said for the benefit of the audience and said, let me take a leaf out of your book and ask you, have you ever had an affair with Praveen Babi? And he looked me straight in the eye and said, no, never, certainly not. And I said to myself, well, he's utterly unflustered. Maybe he means it. And then I looked at him and I said, what about Rekha? And again he looked at me and he said, no, I've never had an affair with Rekha. And at that point, I was out of questions, because as I said, I wasn't researched for this, I wasn't prepared for this, and I'm not aware of the ladies in Amitabh's life. So I looked at Jaya Bachchan, who was sitting beside Amitabh on a sofa that was probably just that size, and I said to her...
In other words, where I'm sitting.
Absolutely, where Mani's sitting. And I said to her, I said, do you believe him? And she looked at me, and she said, of course I believe him. So I said, do you really mean that? Or are you saying that because I'm asking you the question? And this time, she turned and she looked at Amitabh long and lingeringly and said, I always believe my husband.
But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story shows up Karan Thapar, a journalist of integrity who never lets anything go, allowing this to be cut out from the program as it was telecast. Tell us about that and tell us what you did.
Okay, but I have to then go a little further back in the story, because after the interview was over, and the interview lasted, as I said, for an hour, Amitabh absolutely insisted that the crew and I stay for lunch. Now we were hesitant, we felt we were encroaching, we'd been there for long enough, and we felt the job's done, time for us to go, but he was adamant that we stay for lunch. So we agreed. And we sat down to lunch in the adjoining dining room, and Jaya offered him rice because the rotis weren't ready. And he lost his temper on his wife, and he screamed at her and said, you know I don't like rice. I always have rotis. Stop offering me rice. She said, but Amitabh, the rotis are coming in a moment's time, but I thought you could start with rice, and when rotis come, you have that. And he screamed even more. And it was apparent to all of us that this anger was actually his pent-up emotion, that the real object of the anger was Karan, not Jaya. But since politeness demanded that he not take out his wrath on Karan, it was tumbling out on poor Jaya. And this was becoming more and more embarrassing, and it lasted for about 10 minutes, and Jaya then quietly got up and left the room, and we all hurriedly finished what we were eating and disappeared as quickly as we could. When I got back to Delhi, I found that Amitabh had already been in touch with Amar Singh, who had helped arrange the interview with Shobna Bhartiya, who owned the Hindustan Times, to say that this is what had happened. I had, to be honest, a certain doubt in my mind about the propriety of what I had done, because I wasn't intending to ask these questions, and I'd only done it because he'd in a sense tempted me to do so, but I wasn't 100% sure in my mind whether this was the correct thing to do. So when they said that I'd probably misunderstood his question, that he wasn't inviting similar treatment at my hands, and that perhaps it was wrong of me to have misunderstood, I said, fine, we'll drop it. But having agreed to drop this 5-minute section from the interview, I said to myself, and this is always the situation, but the most fun bit has gone. And I couldn't resist that somehow I must find a way of letting the world know that we had this 5-minute with Amitabh. So I got in touch with the Pioneer, which was a very respectable paper in those days that had just opened up in Delhi. Vinod Mehta was the editor, and someone else was the chief of bureau. And I had a word with them, and I said, look, this is what happened. Can you do a story? And the gentleman not only agreed, but the story was the anchor at the bottom of the Pioneer, 8 columns across the bottom, repeating the whole Amitabh incident, exactly what Amitabh had said, and then adding, finally, that this section had been dropped from the final version of Eyewitness.
So having confessed to being completely inconsistent with your professional ethics, I now want to just very quickly draw attention to the fact that you allowed not only a bit from Amitabh Bachchan to be snipped out, but you also helped Narasimha Rao get out of an embarrassing statement that he'd made by asking your London producer to remove the story on that. But when it came to Jayalalitha asking you to re-record an interview when she felt she wanted to do it better, and Advani wanting you to do the same, re-record, because he wasn't very happy about something he'd remarked about Rajnath Singh, his successor as president of the BJP, you then said, and that's your final comment, that instead of sticking to journalistic integrity, which you describe as a somewhat manufactured principle. You say that your true belief is that you cannot put a manufactured principle ahead of trust and friendship. And then weepingly say, I made a terrible mistake because Advani wouldn't talk to you again.
You're slightly distorting the story.
Or are you a politician?
You're slightly distorting the story, which is of course your prerogative to do. The Advani...
It's been yours and you exercise it all the time.
Absolutely, which is why I concede to the right to you entirely. And I'm enjoying this, by the way. The Advani interview was after 7 or 8 earlier interviews that he had given me, and it was pretty apparent by then that that he was kind to me, perhaps even fond of me, and he was giving me interviews, but he wasn't giving them to other people. And that leads to a relationship where there is a certain amount of, I suppose it's not a presumptuous word to use, friendship, a certain amount of understanding between both parties. So when Advani agreed to give an interview in 2006, it was very much against that background that the interview was conducted. Initially he had said, I've stopped being president, I don't think I should do interviews. And I said, no, come on, an interview from you as an ex-president would be an important thing. And I had questioned him at great length about how Rajnath Singh was overturning many critical policies that were identified with Advani, and therefore the BJP under Rajnath Singh, and Rajnath Singh had been there now for about 3 months, was a very different party to the party it had been under Advani. And my idea was to ask Advani whether he approved of the way his policies were being overturned. And he happily answered all the questions. And when the interview was over, he said to me, मुझे ये सही नहीं लगा, मेरे ख्याल में मुझसे गलती हो गई. I shouldn't have answered these questions which are drawing me into talk about my successor. It's not right for me as the ex-BJP president to be talking about my successor, and that too so soon after he's taken over. Let's do it again on any other subject, I don't mind what. But for reasons that I suppose I will never fully understand, I put my foot down. I felt I had a good interview. I felt journalistically it was the correct one to have done. And now that he'd agreed and done the whole interview, there was no reason to change it. And so I refused. 3 days went by with Advani trying very hard to get me to change my mind, and I kept hoping that when he sees the interview, he'll realize that in fact his apprehensions are mistaken, that the interview is acceptable, it's okay. But that didn't happen. The interview went out, and the relationship with Advani snapped. He was never rude, he was never surly, he was never ungracious, but it was quite apparent that something that had existed earlier was now missing from the relationship. And it's in that context that I made the point that looking back, not immediately, but several years later, maybe even a decade later, I said to myself, there was a clash here between a relationship that you had built up over the years, where there was a certain amount of friendship, a certain amount of understanding, and he was willing to give interviews to me long before he was to anyone else, and insisting that I will not change a particular interview where on hindsight he felt he was mistaken giving it because he shouldn't have commented on his predecessor. And I said to myself, if I had been more adult and more mature, I would have said to myself, let's do it again. I can find other good subjects. But I wasn't
actually done. Now let me do a Karan Thapar on you, interrupt you. So there's one rule for Narasimha Rao and another for L.K. Advani, one rule for Amitabh Bachchan and another rule for Jayalalitha, and you have the gall then to pose the question, is it pragmatism or opportunism when it comes to the last lady on my list, which is Aung San Suu Kyi, where you said she has learned to become two different people at almost the same time. She has had to compromise to survive, but her compromise is tilted in favor of retaining power while forsaking principle. Does that apply to you in favor of remaining on TV while forsaking principle?
Possibly. Possibly. I wouldn't deny it. There is an opportunist in all of us, and there are certainly moments when we compromise on certain principles. Hopefully we never compromise with the most important principles, but I think all of us, every single person in this audience, including you, Mani, we are... That's God agreeing with me.
But why don't we see you anymore on TV? I think that's what everybody wants to know.
That's because the BJP decided to boycott me. BJP spokespersons, BJP ministers starting from December 2016 or sometimes I would say January 2017 have decided they don't want to be on my show. Sambit Patra, as good as admitted it in so many words. Prakash Javadekar said to me...
So you're waiting for us to win. And thank you very much. That's
I would be only too happy for you people
I have one last question to ask him before I turn to all of you, or I'll keep that last question for the last. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am. Oh, that young lady. She was brilliant yesterday. I hope you really put him on the mat today. She is, you'll have the next one. Youth as well as her leadership before men and bold men.
So that's both sexist and ageist.
Please start.
If not also rude. But
Please
never mind.
start very
He's
quickly.
a politician, he can be forgiven his rudeness.
Please start
They
very
don't know
quickly.
better.
Please start very quickly.
Good morning, esteemed panelists. My name is Akshi. My question is, sir, you being such a great journalist, you have interactions with so many politicians. Did you ever face any threat for them for the robbing style of yours? And if you ever faced a threat from them asking you, or in any way, how journalists today are subject to being killed, taking the Lanka case, and did you ever face such a threat? And if you did, how did you get off it?
No, to be honest, I've never faced a threat from anyone. I've never sensed that an interview that I was doing, no matter how aggressive, no matter how abrasive, was going to lead to any form of violence. I've often sensed that the person I'm speaking to could get up and walk out, and that's happened a couple of times. But that's very different to people becoming violent or threatening in any way. No, I would be lying if I said politicians have threatened me. They've boycotted me as the BJP does. They refuse to come on my show, and they make it pretty clear why. But that's different to threatening me.
Yes, sir, your question.
This is about two ifs which you talked about. If Benazir had lived and if Rajiv Gandhi had lived, perhaps they would have been different. I would agree with you in case of Rajiv. He may have had the opportunity to change himself. But would any Prime Minister in Pakistan be totally free of the deep state? Nawaz Sharif tried to be different. Where is he now? In jail. Musharraf tried to be different at one time. Where is he? He is out. And let's see where Mr. Imran Khan lands up finally. If you would kindly dwell on that.
The answer to your question is obviously no one knows for sure. But Benazir, if she had come to power the third time, would have come to power at the end of the Musharraf decade. And the military was a fairly discredited institution because of the fact that it had just been in power. And I think civilian politicians in Pakistan are potentially at their strongest when they immediately succeed a military government, particularly one that is discredited. Remember, Bhutto succeeded perhaps the most discredited military government of all, Yahya Khan's, and was a fairly strong prime minister for the first few years of his time. Benazir may not have been in an identical position, but the discrediting of the military would have given her greater leeway and more opportunity. Whether she'd have succeeded and whether the deep state would have resurrected itself and checked her are obviously questions I can't answer affirmatively, leave aside decisively.
I'm sorry, but I've been told that a guillotine is being imposed on further questions. It's a pity, but I'm going to ask my last question and then we dissolve. You said, Karan, about a decade ago on your program, that I was the best interviewer you had ever had. That being so, why am I not in your book?
I'll tell you, Mani, because nice as you are, you're not a lady.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was extremely